This is an interview with Ron Batley, the curator of the Thorpe Abbotts 100th Bomb Group Memorial Museum. Today's date is 26 September 2020. Good afternoon, Ron. Thank you for agreeing to this interview.
Thank you, Rob. Yes.
The focus of this interview is to learn the history of the Thorpe Abbotts Control Tower and how it became a memorial museum. Ron, please tell me about the control tower as it was during World War II.
Well, Rob, the control tower looks very much the same as it did in World War II. Of course, it's a listed building now. We can't change it to look anything other than what it was originally. There was a few aerials and an anemometer on the roof at the time, which we don't use today up there. There was 3 other buildings around it, one which is still standing, used as a display room, building for the museum. Its original purpose was to house lighting, spare bulbs, anything that the control tower crew may use to keep the airfield open. Lights and flare path spares. I'm making a mess of this one here.
That's okay.
That was, like I said, a store. But we've learned from people who came back over the years that one bay of this building was used as a day restroom for the enlisted men who worked in the control tower. There were areas in the tower where the controllers could sit and rest, take a break, but the building was used for that. Adjacent to the tower also was a large, tall building, very similar to the one which is left, which housed something called a chance light. It was like a miniature searchlight, lighthouse type of affair that could be parked out on the airfield, and they could show a light down a runway in poor weather conditions, especially if it was dark, dusk at night. And also it could be used to send out flashes, etc., as a beacon for the airfield. It would give out the identification code for the airfield. There was one other Nissan hut as well, which housed a crash rescue truck, a foam tender, so in case of crash landings, accidents out on the field, they would be in close proximity to get out and deal with any accident. So basically, the tower is original and that one building. Yeah.
Ron, please describe any other buildings or structures which are still standing today.
Well, Rob, there's not that many left. Of course, most of them have been torn down over the years or actually fell down because of old age, etc. There is one barrack hut still left on the 350 site. It's a concrete building, so that's pretty sound. There are a few old Nissan huts still standing on what we call Site 6, in a poor state of repair now, virtually gone. On Site 1, which was the site where the 351st personnel lived, there is a latrine block, actually 2 latrine blocks, one for the officers and one for the enlisted men, and beside it is a large wash room, ablutions as they were called in RAF parlance, still standing there. There's an odd, what they called a transformer site, which had a brick wall round where the electricity transformers were. A few of those around. in the woods. One large building which was used as a standby generating plant building. Of course, in the event of any electricity supply cut, the airfield would still have to be kept operational. So they had this large building with big diesel generators in that could be used to supply power in an emergency situation. That's still standing. A water tower, brick construction, still there, plus two other buildings which were used for the water treatment plant. That's about it. Now these are all on private property, belonging to the landowner. People do go around and have a look, but we always advise people that they should ask permission before they go, because we have no jurisdiction over what goes on out there, of course. Yeah.
Ron, what structures lasted well after World War II and ended up being eventually torn down or dug up?
Well, like many of these airfields, this one included, not long after World War II, they were starting to demolish some of the buildings, hangars, and even tear up the concrete. Thorpe Abbotts seemed to have lasted pretty well intact for a few years after the war. It may not be well known that, of course, after the war there was a very, very big shortage of housing. Now there were tens of thousands of people, especially servicemen coming back from war service, who obviously wanted to find a girl, married, have a home, and there weren't that many houses available for such people. So the government had a scheme where they used many of the huts on these old airfields and military installations. And a Nissan hut could be divided up into a small home, perhaps with 2 bedrooms, a day living room type area and a kitchen area. And many of the huts on Thorpe Abbotts, especially on site number 6, and on the WAF site, as it was known, there were quite a lot of families living there. Eventually these folks moved out into what we call council houses, new houses that were built. The last of them were left here actually in the mid-60s. So a lot of these huts lasted well into the 60s. Hangars were here used for storage for many years, but they eventually went around about the same time. When we started on the control tower project here, most of the airfield runways and taxiways were intact. Some of it had been torn up, but during the late 70s and 80s, much of the runways were then reclaimed and reverted back to agriculture. That's it.
Perfect. Ron, can you tell me a little bit about the towns and villages that surrounded Thorpe Abbotts?
It's Rob. Well, in World War II, of course, this area, which still is, a very rural area, predominantly farming took place here. Lots of little hamlets, villages, perhaps with people, 50, 70, 100 people live in a little village. Thorpe Abbotts, I guess, in World War II, which the airfield took its name from, was a small village of, I should say in World War II, 100, 150 people. Within the airfield boundary, because this was a temporary built airfield, many of the houses and little farms were really left. got to imagine that a modern day military airfield has a large, tall fence to keep everybody out and nobody allowed out from inside virtually. Now, these World War II airfields, there was perhaps 2 strands of barbed wire, like you would keep cattle in a ranch around it. Where the living sites were here at Thorpe Abbotts, they were built around the little hamlet of Upper Street, Billingford. There's another part of the village about half a mile away. There was about, I think there was 19 houses in this little sub-hamlet. I estimate in World War II there was about 75 people would have lived in these houses. There was 3 small farms, various cottages where people lived who were employed in agriculture and the local businesses, mills. Perhaps they worked in the local town of Dis, which would have had population perhaps about 5,000 in those days. So this airfield was built and around the houses. And the folks who lived there had been living in, what do we call it, horse and cart era. Yes, there were cars around in those days and trucks and tractors. There was no concrete roads as such. A lot of them were gravel tracks. The airfield was constructed with concrete roads, modern buildings, with all the facilities we would expect today, with running tapped water, electricity. Now, the little cottages then had none of that. They had oil lamps, they had coal or wood fires, and had ranges where they could cook on. So water would possibly come from a well, a pump somewhere in the backyard, and their toilet facilities would be in the backyard. So they were living in a past age, while the young men who came to Thorpe Abbotts were living in the modern age, as it were, with all the facilities we would expect today. And the people who lived in the little hamlet had to have a pass because they were basically living within the perimeter of the airfield. But of course, these folks got on well with the personnel on base, and they went about their duties, and as the personnel went about theirs. Since World War II, the villages, like everywhere, have expanded just a little bit. There's more houses being built in the little villages. The town of Dis, which was perhaps the nearest one here to the base, of course, possibly now was quadrupled in size, possibly more. But that was the situation back in World War II. Thank you.
Ron, are there still people living nearby who remember what it was like during World War II?
Yes, Robert, there are just a few left. You've got to remember that people who were here, adults in World War II, are largely gone. But the people who are living nearby were youngsters here. They had great delight in coming onto the airfield and meeting the ground crew especially. There's lots of wonderful stories of their meeting with these guys. And of course there's lots of stories about Mum and Dad inviting these young men home to their place to have share their food with them. Of course everybody was on rations then, so there wasn't that much to go round, but so there's lots of great stories of these youngsters and how they got along with the personnel. One or two little things that stick in my mind is Gordon Debenham, the late Gordon, who's passed away only a month or two ago, he remembers well that one of the ground crew used to come round and see them quite regularly, and he asked where Father was, and he said he was in his barn working on his tractor, and he had a problem with the engine on an Alice Chambers tractor, which was an import from the United States. And I think that got to have new pistons and all the other bits and pieces in. I said I'll pop down and have a look. And saw William they called him, and he said, I say, Will, he said, I'll tell you, he said, I got one of my buddies on base who used to work in the Alice Chalmers factory somewhere back home. He knows all there is to know about the tractors. I'll get him along. And apparently this young man came along and put the engine, tore the engine down or whatever, and put it all back together again for Will. There was also lots of people who knew the air crew as well, and of course there were sad stories when they got to know these young men and then they were lost on missions. Yes, lots of great stories out there of the friendships that were made. Good.
Ron, what are your earliest memories of Thorpe Abbotts in the 100th Bomb Group?
I was born 1946, just after World War II, but of course in the years directly after World War II, people were talking about the air base, the Americans who were here, and lots of stories. My dad, I can remember this, and telling me things that had happened. And I was always fascinated by what must have gone on this air base, which was about half a mile from our backyard. And I would be listening to what people were saying. And I always wondered, as a youngster, what did they actually do here? What the buildings that were around them, which were quite a lot in the end of the 50s, what did they do in this building? Where the young men who served here? I just wanted to be part of it and find out what had happened. Of course, there was not much information about the 8th Air Force as it was in those days. Eventually, I recall meeting a few veterans who had came back, perhaps in the 1960s, to the local village. And I think I remember my mum saying that somebody who she remembered and the people in the village had come back. And I can't remember it now, but I can remember going to meet this man, and I can't remember who he was. But a few vets came back. But every time somebody came back, that sort of fired me up a bit more, you know. Eventually, of course, with the families living up in these huts after the war, I used to get up here quite a bit. We went to little birthday parties with our school friends and stuff like that in these huts. But I think at the time that really didn't mean that much to me, although I was in them. So eventually, in the mid-70s, I went to work on the farm that is owned by our landlord, Sir Rupert Mann here, who leased this area and the museum to us. And I met a veteran. We were working out on the fields, on the airfield, and an elderly gentleman turned up in a car, and he asked if he could go and have a look at the old flying control tower. Well, I knew immediately that he was from the United States. And my dad was there at the time, and he said, well, yeah, you can go and have a look around it. He said, what do you know about it? He said, I worked in there in World War II. His name was Welland C. Folland, Smokey, he went to Smokey, his nickname was Smokey. And Smokey came, and I remember I left the tractor standing out there, and we came in and spent a good hour more wandering around the tower, and he was telling me stories about his memories. Fantastic, it really was. It was about perhaps 2 years after that when we started on the control tower project here, but obviously that's another question, which I can get to in a minute.
Ron, what are your earliest memories of meeting survivors of the Bloody 100?
Well, my earlier question, I said I'd met a couple of veterans, but when we really got to know something about the veterans and meet veterans of the 100th Bomb Group was when we started this project in about 1977. A young man who had worked on the local farm here, it was a youngster in World War II, and he knew some of the ground crew men of the 351st Squadron. One in particular was Robert Spangler, who was the line chief of the 351st. And I can remember we were here, and Peter Seaman, gone now, Peter has, he said, I'll tell you, he said, one of the vets who served here is staying in our local village. His name was Robert Spangler, and he said, I'm sure he'd like to meet you folks, and he's got lots of stories to tell, no doubt. And I've kept how I think it was Deborah's dad who went off to the where he was stopping and brought him up here, and that really was the first sort of 100th veteran that we got to know very well. Robert, by then, was working for Pan American World Airways and used to come across, well, he did come across from then on quite regular basis. But when we started this project, we knew very little about the 100th Bomb Group. The late Roger Freeman had written the book, The Mighty Eighth, some years before, and I think that sort of galvanized people into action, because it was written down, they could read about just what had happened to these on these airfields, etc. But we were here in the very early days of the museum, and we learned that a coach would be coming round to visit some of the old 8th Air Force bases, and they would be coming here. And that, I can't remember how many, there was possibly 5 or 6 guys on there who were 100th Bomb Group veterans. And one of them was the acting base commander, John Bennett. And anyhow, we made sure we were going to be here. And he, I think at the time, gave us, I think it was $100 or $200 bill to put towards our project. But more than that, he said, have you guys been in touch with the United States? And we said, no. Who do we contact the United States? Well, we have an association. And there are 2 guys who were running the show. You ought to get in contact. So he gave us the address of Mr. Horace Varian, who was the group adjutant here during the war. We wrote to Horace, and that started off a chain sort of reaction, I guess. But that's how we really got involved with veterans, and that went on from there.
Ron, can you tell me a little bit more about how the control tower got saved and then converted into a museum, a memorial museum?
That's Robert. I think we've got to go back to 1977. A man by the name of Mike Harvey come to live down in the area here and work. Basically, he came down to the area for work. While he was down here, of course, you want to explore the area where you're living, and somehow or other he came up onto this airfield and looked at the derelict control tower. Of course, in those days, before restoration, it was covered in undergrowth, ivy, brambles, trees, stuff growing around it. But he came along, clambered up through the old buildings, and somehow I think worked his way up onto the roof. Although there was only a few steps left in the stairway, he got up there, gazed out across the airfield, and I think his thoughts wandered. Hard to perhaps put into words, but I think he had an intense feeling for the place, and he felt that something should be done to perhaps preserve it in memory of what went on here and the young men who served here. Like I said, at the time he didn't know anything perhaps much about it. He was pointed in my direction because I worked for the landowner who owns the buildings. He called round the house and my wife said, well, he's at work, he'll be back later tonight if you'd like to come round. And so Mike arrived at the door and told me his plans. And I said, well, you're crazy. I said, how do you think we can do that? I said, we've got no monies. I said, no expertise, you know, to do something like this. But yeah, I can imagine a good idea, and yes, I'm interested in the airfield, but to do something like that had never entered my mind. And he said, do you know any other folks around? I said, well, there's lots of people here who've got memories of World War II and the air base. Some who were youngsters here, even the older people, of course. Do you think that we could get a bunch of people together and form some sort of group and at least talk about it? Yeah. So this is what we did. Talked to people I knew with memories, and a little group of us got together in our ex-trustee's home, sat down, talked about it, and everybody seemed to agree, yes, it would be something good to do and be involved in. But how do we get this place? So they all looked at me and said, well, as you work for the landowner, I think you better go and ask him. So it was my job to ask him. So I saw my boss one day and asked him what was the future of the old control tower up here and the other buildings around. Well, he said, we'll bulldoze them down, clear the land, and we'll revert it back to agriculture. Of course, in those days, there was a great incentive to grow more food, take more land, which was lying derelict, perhaps. But he said, why do you ask? And I told him why. And he said, I can't remember exact words, but I think he said, what a damn good idea, Sir Rupert said. He said, if you get something down on paper, pass it on to me, I'll see what we can do. So, oh, good. So eventually I got round, told all the guys what he'd said. So we sat down and formulated a plan, I suppose, of what we thought or Mike would like to see done here. And eventually Sir Rupert, man, whose ancestors had farmed here for a few generations, gave this building, or this area, and the old tower to us for a long lease of 999 years to specifically use as a memorial museum to the 100th Bomb Group who served in World War II. So that's basically how we started, the project started. It's a long time ago now. Yeah.
Ron, can you tell me more about the relationship of the museum with the 100th Bomb Group Foundation and the 100th Air Refueling Wing?
Well, Robert, as I said in the earlier interview, we first made contact with what was then the association, 1977-78, when we met the ex-wing commander, or group commander here then, and we contacted the 100th Association via Mr. Varian. We were invited to attend a reunion in 1979 in San Antonio, Texas. Mike, Richard Gibson, and myself decided we would like to go. Bear in mind, we'd never been, I think, on an airliner before or gone anywhere like that. This was a new experience. We didn't know what we were going to see. We flew to Boston, met Mr. Varian, eventually flew across the states to San Antonio, Texas, to the Menga Hotel. In those days, a reunion of the 100th Bomb Group could be up to 1,000 people. Most of the veterans were still around, or a lot of them were. Their wives, family, really big events. Us three little guys from England were then there. Difficult to describe. There were people with badges on who we'd read about. Crosby, Blakely, Rosenthal, Eddie Purdy, this one, that one. It was just mind-boggling. We were welcomed with open arms, handshakes, slaps on the back. How you guys? Just good to have you here. That's our first real experience of getting involved with the association as it was then. Anyhow, after then, we had numerous reunions here through the 80s and 90s where the veterans came along with their wives. Every 2 or 3 years, we'd have perhaps 3 coachloads of people here. And what wonderful experience it was too. Learning something all the time, new. And of course they brought much information, but they also gave us uniform documentation. A lot of the stuff that we have here came from the veterans. Certainly a wonderful experience. But also they were very generous in supporting this place. Lots of monies came this way. Trusts were set up to support this and make it what it is today. Without their help, I'm not so certain that, well, we don't know what the place would have been like today, but with their generosity, it's turned into what it is. I think a lot of them at the time couldn't quite understand how people could give up their spare time free of charge to do something like this. But thinking about World War II, when these young men came here, and these bomb groups came, most of the people around this area said that these guys had come to help us, because as my dad once told me, you know, perhaps more than once, that he said, had they not have come, he said, they shortened the war by coming and participating. If that had gone on and on for longer, he said, that could have turned out very differently. So that's how we really got involved with the 100th Bomb Group. And of course, the 100th Area Fooling Wing came into existence in 1992. And we were invited along to the changeover ceremony at RAF Mildenhall. Carol and I went. I'm not certain of who else at the time, but this is when the big square D came back on the fins of the tankers. And since then, every year we have been to the base, not just us, me and Carol, but some of the volunteers here and trustees have been to the base for various events over the years. Change of command, the Yuletide events at Christmas time, and various other things. And that's gone on year and still does up to the present day. And of course we've had lots of visits from the wing here for the years, seminars, history visits, you name it, we've had it. So yes, there's this family tie up with the foundation in the States, the 100th Area Fooling Wing at Mildenhall, and us here at Thorpe Abbotts, the 100th family as it's known.
Ron, are there any other memories or stories that you'd like to share?
But yes, there's lots. Perhaps I forgot some of them, but there are a few things that stick in my mind. Way back, I can't remember the exact date, it's when the B-17 that came from France, which is now the Sally B at Duxford. When it first came over here to England, it did fly around the area a bit, and I remember we were here one time and it flew across the airfield. Now, I suppose that was the first time a B-17 flown across the airfield since World War II. My legs went like jelly. Big lump to think. So that happened several times since, because some of the reunions we had the Sally B perform here, and my legs turned to jelly, a big lump. It would still have that effect if it came over today. Of course, in those early days of restoration, we would be here in the evenings. Mike, he was out of work some of the time. He would spend most of the day here. He was constructing cabinets and generally working here. He spent hours. And we would come in the evening when we left off work and be here. And also I remember one evening, a car came up the taxiway, came in here. This young man got out of the car, and his girlfriend, actually his wife, his name was Mark Copeland. He's still a member, he's a member of the Foundation Board in the United States. And Mark had just been married in the United States. He'd had a World War II style wedding, I think with all the uniforms and regalia of the era. and came to England for an air base tour around the old 8th Air Force bases. He just turned up out of the blue, and I can remember him walking around in here, and as he went round and looked in each room in the tower, he was going, wow, whoa, wow, you guys. Now, as I said, he was just married. His wife never got a look in. I can't remember, I think she was just sitting aside while he was just going round marvelling at what was here and what we were doing. And Mark obviously went on and looked around lots of other air bases, and I think possibly his wife was just tagging on behind. But there was numerous occasions when people would turn up. Sometimes a veteran would just turn up out of the blue while we were here, which is something very exciting, of course. Yeah, they're just two of the little things that come to mind.
Final question. Did you ever think you would become essentially the curator of this amazing memorial museum?
In the early days, Robert, I don't think any of us had any idea what this place was going to turn into. We had no idea what we'd set ourselves up for. This was a little project, but the project turned into something, I'm sure, far beyond our wildest dreams. Yes, there's other museums around, some of them only small, some of them perhaps a little bigger, they got more. But we've got, I suppose, a unique place in all this. Because we've still got the 100th Air Refuelling Wing, which is still active. Now, a lot of the bomb groups can't take their heritage up to the present day. The 100th can. That's unique. And of course, being involved with the 100th Bomb Group, it was the legend of the 100th, which I suppose that is the legend. If there's still people who come here and say, oh, these fellas were wiped out, none of them went back home. They're still imprinted in people's minds that this was a bad outfit to get involved in because they've read the stories. But as we well know, this, when people tell you that they lost more than anybody else, they didn't. On average, it was the same as all the other groups. Some of them lost very heavily, more than 100. It was just that there were times and odd missions that they happened to be perhaps in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they got hit severely. And that had a great effect on the personnel. Of course it did. But that thing has stuck. So, 100th Bomb Group, Thorpe Abbotts, it's in the forefront of all of it. But yes, to what this place has become is beyond our wildest dreams. I think Dad would be really proud of when he started this off. He never had an idea, but yeah, it was turned into something that very special, very special.
Ron, thank you for taking the time today, and I want to thank you for your lifetime of devotion to this museum and this memorial. Just about anyone I've talked to from anywhere in the world will tell me that the museum and Ron and Carol Batley are all associated with one and the same in the spirit that you carried on from the foundations of the museum. Thank you for all you've done.
Well, like I said, I know my wife has supported me greatly over these years, She's not a trustee, she's just a volunteer. We've got some good people here who are looking forward to taking this forward further on into the future. Of course, we've got a lot more years to go as yet. There we have. All right, thanks, Rob.